Kenneth Stevenson is running a film company in this authoritarian moment. He has worked for Time Warner, SONY, and been the recipient of various local film festival awards and a scholarship he received from David Letterman. A dual entrepreneur and artist at heart, Kenneth co-founded Digital Alliance in 2015 to service nonprofits and brands with their video marketing, and was awarded a scholarship in 2021 from the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity to briefly study in Washington, D.C. During episode 35, we reminisced about our initial connection when he expressed intrigue in my film, Real Unity, here on Free the People. During this episode, we discuss the people-pleasing done in the advertising industry attempting to attract a wider audience rather than a target audience. We also talk about his first feature film, Cheery Point, which illustrated a story of a totalitarian medical state enforced on a small town and how joyful the awakening process can be. Kenneth later found himself initially infatuated with the BLM movement, while trying to support a fellow screenwriter on his journey to film Making Space, which creatively depicted a variety of perspectives on the protests. Coming from a place of agape love, Kenneth eventually found himself in a moral conflict when a participating group wanted to sign the project's contract as a collective. I'm Sienna Heath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty.
Well, Kenneth, finally, at last we meet on the mic. After many a private talk throughout the 2020s and gaining perspective and experience on topics that were rather raw at first. So as some may know, because I have shared with some friends and close colleagues, we connected when you discovered my film, Real Unity, which is here on this channel on Free the People. And that was created or co-created with Sam Martin here, and my experience of waking up, so to speak. And, in hindsight, I feel like the whole awake, not woke thing is kind of just, a version of the same. But that's kind of how I framed it back then. And I was happy that you were one of the first to reach out and say that you resonated with the experience of, or rather the envisioning of what a healthy, wholesome, and perhaps spiritually inspired version of unity in diversity of sorts could look like. But I know since then, perhaps our perspectives have changed. I know I've become a little less optimistic or have a longer view of it. I would like to start with exploring the broader topic of unity, not uniformity, how it affects your work, how you're weaving in your desire for unity, but also liberty in your work as a filmmaker, and then reflect back on your experience with my film. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me and the opportunity to talk with you, because in a strange way, ever since seeing your short film, it has felt like I've, in a strange way, may have known you somehow. Just the way you're talking just seems very reminiscent of, I don't know, just like family members, the way we would talk to each other. And it just seemed, it hit at a moment that was really raw, that we could talk about. But I just wanted to thank you really quickly, Sienna, for having me on here. I love the work that you're doing. I think it's so important. And a lot of the dissidents that you're talking with have provided little morsels of motivation in this trying time to just keep going. So thank you.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Well, I'm honored that you relate our connection to family, because I agree. I think there were very profound connections made at first online. Even me connecting with Free the People, it was online and just kind of shouting into the cyberspace, wondering if anyone was asking any of the same questions. And since then, I've connected with fellow dissidents, or maybe what I call kindred spirits in person, and I hope we can one day, but I'm grateful to be connecting with you now on the mic. Looking at unity, not conformity, more broadly, you've mentioned to me that unity, or what you can qualify as centralization, may or may not be inherent to human nature and seen in the natural world. What are your thoughts on the dance between uniformity and individualism, or what you might call centralization versus decentralization? Are you seeing that exhibited in nature? Do you see more like authoritarian practices in nature? Perhaps like, I think a middle ground, what I see is like a voluntary interdependence, between beings, various species. But I know that's something that's been on your mind. So would you like to share a bit more?
Yeah, I think that's a great first question to dig into. Again, this is just me. I'm not a biologist. I'm not, an anthropologist, but from my experience, and just looking at, you know, how animals seem to work, and my speculation is that in the natural world, unity is a joyful, voluntary exchange of seeing one another in a charitable light and meeting one another where each other are at. And I can't stress enough the word voluntary. Like that is to me the key ingredient to creating that joyful experience. Whereas I think uniformity requires force. It's molding something that is not natural together. And it could be for what some claim are good reasons. It could be later viewed as bad reasons. But to me, it really doesn't matter, because I think we should be striving authentically as much as we can towards the natural, because I think it creates such a sense of anxiety, angst, and just, we all know with how much anxiety there is right now in our daily lives. The last thing we want to do is add anything on top of all that. So, I mean, I really do believe that. I also think that I guess it is natural for power to coalesce into centers, like, and to centralize. But I think that it is kind of sociopathic, or I mean, that's just my opinion. I tend to think that those that have the narcissistic qualities among us, that are the loudest in the room, that gather attention. I mean, I think you can see that in chimps. I think you can see that in other mammals or animals as well, that there's a dominance factor that might be evolutionary beneficial to gravitate towards for survival. But I just think it's not sustainable. And I think that my last thought initially is that unity is something to strive for, but it's not guaranteed. I think that it's something, I think that's where a lot of religious precepts come in, and a lot of utopians get it wrong, where it's like, well, I want to make this world in this unity driven vision. It's like, yeah, but that's not guaranteed, and it wouldn't be voluntary if we were to force it on everyone. So for me, as a someone that grew up as a Christian, I view unity as the kingdom of God that is not here yet. That is something we can hope for and we can emulate to the best of our ability. But boy, does it go sideways fast when someone tries to make it so. Like, it's just, it doesn't seem like a theocracy is anything we want. So anyway, that's my initial thought.
Yeah, I think those of us that have those spiritual beliefs are what I like that you called hopes, something we can hope for. Maybe we get excited or even zealous and say, look, like we could do so much better on this planet and, like, quote unquote, make the world a better place. But even attempting to make the world a better place involves force, perhaps, even if it's like on an individual level, like persuasion. It involves persuasion, rather than emulating or highlighting existing examples of unity, or what I also prefer to call voluntary interdependence, which we see in other parts of the natural world. And reflecting on your art and considering like that nature is often considered a work of art, what motivates your art, and what are the dangers to uniformity in the creative process?
Yeah. I create right now out of a sense of joy and fear. So what brings me joy are the opportunities that authentic liberty can present. Like, I think it is so invigorating. One of my first feature film, Cheery Point, I look back at it. It's a totalitarian medical state that's foisted upon this small town in America in a not too distant future. And I made it in 2012 in response to the Occupy movement. And there's a whole lot of reasons behind that. But to your question, when I think about what excited me about that was, okay, picture as bad as it could get, you know, the theocracy or the uniformity that everybody's scared of right now that could happen, and how joyful that awakening process can be. There was a scene in that film where like the camera like dollies in and it's this green pasture of wide open, expansive opportunity. And it's this group of people just throwing a ball together and having a good time. And it kind of got criticized on IMDb at a time. It was kind of funny. It was like, hey, this is like a fraternity, like, you know, like fraternity bros, like throwing football, which was never my intention, but it was something that came up of like, you know, I'm not really one for collectivism in general. So when that was like kind of levied against me in some funny way as a joke, I was like, okay, well, if liberty naturally lends itself to joyful unity, fine. That's great. But yeah, on the other side, the fear that motivates me is very much, you know, like films that we've seen, like, you know, The Giver, Equilibrium, Gattaca, any number of these dystopian films that don't seem all that far-fetched anymore to me. That, you know, I get a creepy, instinctual sensation whenever I hear that song, Imagine. And it's strange because a lot of people, that gives them joy. They're like, imagine all the people, you know, and it's so provocative in the imagery it creates. But I'm like, yeah, but rewind the song, like, and the stuff you don't hear that happened right before that. Like, what happened to get all these people to behave this way? I mean, it would take such a tremendous amount of force. And that's kind of what drives my work is how do we get back to a place where we can have an authentic sense of liberty, and we can strive for that unity, but we don't try to foist all this on our neighbors all the time. That's what drives me right now. So a lot of it used to be a lot of science fiction stuff. My first film was a piece of science fiction. That's what I thought it was. And I would continue to make like supernatural type content. And then in the last few years, I was like, you know, I don't need to set this into some far out land. Like I can just do drama, because what used to be science fiction, I suppose, is just now everyday drama. Like, and that's kind of alarming. It's really alarming. But yeah, that's what motivates me right now, is how to, I suppose, create a new set of myth-making tools that my kids and other people that might come along can look to and say, oh, okay, like there's another option. That's kind of where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned The Giver, the film, which is based on a book by Lois Lowry. That was one of the first books I read in middle school. It was required reading, but I didn't feel it as such. I really loved it, and I ended up reading the series. I don't know if you know, it's a series of 4 books in the same universe. I discovered that in adulthood, and I was so excited because I absolutely loved the first book. And I'm recalling that in the novel, the dumbing down was done with required pills, and then in the film made years later, it was injections. Just kind of calls back to it a few years ago, you know. And I guess more philosophically, something that came up for me when I was watching the film and reflecting on the book was how the sense that maybe perhaps the most sensitive soul in the community was almost regarded like a shaman. And my understanding is in some indigenous tribes, the sensitive, intuitive type of person is regarded very highly, whereas like in the more modern Western world, we don't take that person seriously. And I know in my experience of coming out in the quote unquote liberty movement, like I just wanted to be myself, speak my piece, even like produce some poetry, which we did during the Defeat the Mandates era, and just be like that sensitive artist type in a field that's more so dominated by those like rough and gruff, both men and women who just want to say it how it is. And I'm not like that. And the main characters in The Giver were also not of that temperament. And I'm curious, like, what comes up for you as a fellow artist in this sphere of advocating for liberty, working with libertarian principles and inspiring that perhaps in your coworkers in the field of film? Do you find like there is some resistance or discomfort to the more like artsy types in this realm of advocating for individual rights?
Most certainly. It has been incredibly difficult to exist as a libertarian in the film industry right now. I mean, I think right now, the way I see it is you have two divergent industries that are running. One that is newly formed, that is increasingly developing in the South, in Nashville and in Florida through the Daily Wire. You're starting to get films with Breitbart. You're going to start to see a lot of right-wing content being created, and it's going to start creating this whole new industry. And you're already seeing during the mask mandates, for example, crews that wouldn't come near one another. You had a lot of people that were banished from sets because of vaccine mandates and their unwillingness to comply, that were suddenly saying, you know what, fine, if I'm not good enough for you to work with, if I'm a deplorable, I'm going to go to Nashville and you guys can just deal with it. And they weren't even necessarily right-wing people. They were just like, you know what, these people are going to welcome me with open arms, so I'm going to go work with them. And in the process, strangely enough, I'm finding that they're not as deplorable as I may have once imagined. And they're very open to talking with me. We don't agree with everything we say, but at least they're willing to have the conversation. Now, that's not everybody. I'm not just saying, go red team or whatever. But that seems to be happening in the film industry right now. Now, in the advertising industry, which is where I'm primarily focused at the moment, I hope to make my way back to the film industry at some point. But the advertising industry, it is not as, it still has a little bit to follow suit with the film. They have, what's interesting about the ad industry is you have, like, it is directly financed by these brands who have traditionally been just capitalists through and through. But as of recently, woke capitalism has sort of become the new currency of the ad world. They get a lot of clout from it. And while you do have people like Red Balloon, Brett Craig, Daily Wire opened an agency to go about it. It's a little bit harder to make out, like, who are you working with on set? Like, are you working with people that, espouse the kind of things that you want to be involved in or not? And I have noticed there's been a distinct shift in that as of recent. And I noticed it when I moved back to Louisville from Chicago. I was trying to administer just an ungodly amount of administrative HR nightmares with, I had at one point crews in 3 different states on I-65 that had vastly different CDC guidance on a state level. And trying to have those crews keep up with what those states were mandating was a nightmare. And that's just what the guidance was. It was what those individuals felt, and what the clients would feel on those sets was so disparate that you just had to throw your hands up in the air and say, this doesn't make any sense. Like, this isn't going to work. And I saw that schism starting to happen in that industry as well. The last story I would tell on this real quick is I was directing a piece in Louisville. And at one point, everybody was on their phones on set. And I looked around and I had written this scene that was kind of this intimate family scene where they were saying a prayer before dinner, which I knew was like something that you generally didn't do for an ad. And I did it anyway. And at the end of that scene, when we wrapped, everybody was just like, I've never like felt this like included before. I've never felt like everyone there, no one knew that we all happened to be Christians of different denominations. We never felt comfortable speaking about it. But at that moment we were like, wow, that was wild. Like, I didn't know that you were coming from that background. I didn't know you were coming from that background. And it was just kind of interesting to see that your original question was more about libertarianism, not Christianity. But what I'm trying to suggest and put forward is that for a long time, the left has had a very strong hold on both Hollywood and the Mad Men sort of advertising world. And I do think we're starting to see a reaction to that hopefully is something we can aspire to and doesn't get out of control, but who knows? But yeah, as far as a libertarian specific, I try to sit down with business partners and write out, like, we want to run our company according to the non-aggression principle. We want to, really ensure that we have a diversity of thought and that we can foster an environment where, it really is up to looking at people as individuals and not as groups, because that became a really big issue as an executive in a company. Was like, we had people all the time that would just assume, well, you're looking at me because of, I think this way, so I'm part of this group. And it's like, well, stop using labels and just for a second hone in. You're so-and-so, you are a part of this company for a reason. Your merit suggests that you are really good at this. Why don't we start there and see if we can build some bridges around that? But I'll be honest with you in saying that when the social unrest and vaccine mandates and mask and all that stuff erupted, it was impossible. It was, and I can only imagine what it does in a large company. Like, we were a small company. Like, so for me, I mean, I'm interested to know how much more you'd like to go into detail about that, because there are so many examples of how the pandemic destroyed small businesses, but that's a pretty large subject.
Right. And, reflecting on when we connected during the release of my film, Real Unity, one of the primary themes of that film was through like artistic and natural world inspired examples, how unity and diversity, or rather specifically diversity of thought, was considered or could be considered a strength. But upon further reflection and just observation of the past few years, I do think that there are inherently divisive belief systems and approaches to various topics. Like the vaccine mandates are just inherently divisive. You can't really get around that. I would like to think that those from a variety of different opinions on that issue would agree. There's one approach that's divisive, that literally, draws a line and keeps some people out, creates in-groups and out-groups. And then there's the, defeat the mandates, just beautiful unity that ballooned from those protests, particularly in Canada, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated walking together with their sweet little signs. And, I didn't think that lacked substance. I think that was just a really potent time and experience of unity and diversity. But I think some of what you're describing in your field, it's, ideally you don't want to put labels on people. You want to just embrace everyone equally. But, for instance, some of the prevailing theories and practices around race, I mean, some believe that the races, this was terrible. I mean, I think it's so regressive, but some on the left and the right believe that the races shouldn't mix and that we actually thrive better if we stick to our own, which is absolutely abhorrent to me. And I have a spiritual belief that that the more we unite culturally, the stronger that we are, which I know, is said by more than one side or the other. But in practice, I think the libertarian sort of free-flowing creation of a space where we organically inspire, perhaps, or just allow for that unfolding is ideal.
Well, that really comes for me, Sienna, from I grew up in a Reaganite Republican household. I did, and we can talk about it maybe later. But it wasn't until later that I realized this isn't me anymore. I'm not a neocon. That was something that I really came to grips with in the last few years. But for me, it's okay, I value a lot of the spirit of 1776. I really do. But for me, what perpetuates me towards libertarianism is this insatiable curiosity and this desire for lifelong learning. And I just never quite got that in my tribe when I was on the red team. It was always well, here's how it is. Here's how it's always been. Let's make sure it stays that way. And for me, it was what? There's so much possibility. There's so many different people to meet and so many different ideas to be explored. And that doesn't need to diminish our most held beliefs. We can coexist, and maybe that is idealistic in practice. It certainly seemed like it was. But I will say on the last point with the business stuff, unfortunately, I've come to the realization that when you're running a business and you also happen to be an artist, those are two clashing, very contentious things, because the business needs a hierarchy that works and that is stable. And it needs to be concerned with providing resources to the employees, the stakeholders, whatever it might be. It needs to grow. And when you're an artist that's trying to hold on dearly to some of these ideas that don't sometimes naturally come about in the workplace, it definitely is a source of destability, and it definitely creates division, and it doesn't allow for growth, and people do get hurt because the companies aren't providing that output that allows those people to go home and provide for their families or whatever it might be. I'm not for necessarily infinite growth and all this uber capitalism. I am a capitalist, but I just don't. I've come to realize that for me, ultimately, if I want to satisfy my needs and itch as an artist, I can't be looked at as the head of a giant organization, because I am inherently unstable. I'm somebody that wants to explore ideas, not from a mental standpoint, but just I need to allow for that deconstruction, if that makes sense. I mean, do you have any similar thoughts on that art versus entrepreneurs? Because you have motivations as a go-getter that aren't necessarily found in all artists. Do you ever find those things conflict?
Well, I find that I go through creative spurts. I think that having a more consistent creative practice allows one to have that flow in place, so that you do have the more entrepreneurial motivation. There was something else you said. Could you refresh my memory? One of the last things you said was the clash, of course. And I think that's why a lot of artists probably, if they can afford it, hire assistants. I actually work with architects, and often like when they can finally like make their way into hiring an assistant, it just makes their life so much easier. And I'm surprised that AI is really coming to mind, because it's not something I really meant to bring up, but some see AI as like a writing assistant, for instance. Like, it's not a hindrance, it's not a danger, but rather you have to use it to your advantage. And that frees you up to do, what humans do, and just create. I don't know. I mean, I'm flattered that like you see me as like quite entrepreneurial, but I think I have my moments where, yes, like I elevate a certain project, and like, yeah, I'm really proud of it. But there's plenty that goes on under the surface that's, rather private and not necessarily like business oriented.
I can appreciate that. I mean, and think too, like, just to go back to the advertising for a second, like, you do see the disruption that a place like Budweiser experiences, or a place like, I mean, any number of brands that you could insert in the current climate that have tried to placate everybody and try to act as if they can be a mouthpiece for all ideologies. And then when it comes to the rubber hitting the road and the consumer buying the product, it's like, unfortunately for you, it doesn't work, because, if you're so, and this is something that like just drives me crazy in general, that it's like, if you're so diverse that you can't find a single string of unity if there's nothing to be found there's nothing spiritually transcendent that connects all of that stuff, then you're not authentic, and no one's going to trust you anymore. And no one's going to, I mean, never mind buy from you. No one's going to want to be around you. So, because you've lost your clout as someone that, I do think that we as animals are tribal. I think that is natural. That decentralization is healthy and natural. And I think localism is increasingly an answer to that. But it doesn't mean that you can't strive to find coalitions. But when there are no coalitions to be had, don't try to force something that isn't going to work. That's just my thought.
Right. And when you mentioned that, you are a free thinker and you like to entertain various ideas, and now you're also, I think what you're getting at is like the necessity for spiritual principles, or just principles in general. Like, what is the common thread that unifies you, even as a person? Like, what keeps you consistent? I think is really crucial to not becoming a people pleaser. Like, when I hear you just describing how advertising agencies attempt to appeal to as many people as possible, I mean, my understanding of marketing and advertising, and actually my own experience, is that you want to hone in on a specific niche of people, a niche audience, a target audience. And maybe we're not seeing that as much. Maybe we're seeing a form of people pleasing in the ad industry. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, it's almost like and I lay this squarely at the feet of some of the ideologues that are coming out of the college campuses that are kind of infiltrating these organizations at this point. I mean, it's going to take a couple generations if we have any hope of kind of quelling this toxic ideology. But there's this idea of like, that I think that I understand where you align on, that it's like you flatten these intersectional distinctions and say, oh, well, there really is no difference between a man and a woman, or there really is no difference between this faction and this faction. And it's, I don't even know. I used to think it all came from a good place, but I don't even know anymore, because in practice, it's become so egregious to watch that I don't know how it couldn't be construed at this point as anything other than abusive. Like, it's very strange to watch it transpire. But the Budweiser, that's kind of, I don't see that as well, I mean, that one was it definitely offended people, but it's not as egregious as sort of wholesale erasure of like a sex or something. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, but yeah.
Yeah, the Budweiser example, I think is a really good example of people pleasing, and then also neglecting your target audience, like trying to please all these other people who don't drink your product, but like appeasing the prevailing culture.
And look, like I'm not going to
Yeah.
be the guy necessarily that goes out in the backyard and shoots up a bunch of cans with Kid Rock. Like I'm not that kind of right winger, but I know I have enough common sense to know that that beer has been consumed by so much. It's been such a fraternity culture driven. Also, like in the South, like that beer is like Sunday after church, you're going to get some chicken and have some Budweiser. So like that's the target audience. Like, what are you doing? What did you think was going to happen? So I don't know. Do you ever feel like they know what they're doing and they're trying to elicit a response?
Yeah, it's possible that they're strategizing, attracting a scandal and upsetting their target audience, and then bringing in Kid Rock and appeasing their target audience, and targeting pain points. That's another strategy in marketing and advertising. Okay, what are my clients' pain points? But usually it's like you do it in a way that appeals to their pain points, doesn't like aggravate their pain points. I don't know if there's suddenly a new approach being taken at Budweiser, for example, but that's the only way I can currently rationalize what they're doing.
So this is a total coincidence, but it just so happens that the director of the famous Clydesdale horse Budweiser commercial that so many people remember, he was a guy that was on our company's directing roster. At the time, we thought it was a good idea to kind of run our company with a diversity of faces that could be picked up by agencies, is what a lot of these agencies do. They'll say, oh, okay, do you have somebody that matches this demographic or this criterion? We want them to tell the story. So we tried that, and it ended up not being the right road for us for a lot of reasons. But the gentleman that directed that commercial was on our roster. And so what it was amazing was in real time seeing his reaction to the Budweiser fallout. And he's from Spain. He's a Spaniard. And so he was like caught up in this controversy because the executives at Budweiser were trying to recycle his footage and use it in a way to try and save face. And he's like, you guys think that's authentic? Like, I'm a Spaniard, that's my thought of what America is. And so it was just, my point is, it was just interesting to see the mental gymnastics that these agencies and production companies are going through to try and attract audiences in a way. Like, the new currency is your demographic. Like, that's what it is. Like, they're, and I think that's why I'm trying to disentangle myself from being as involved in, I don't know, just going at it as an individual. Like, with the way AI is going, I really don't think we're that far away from an artist with a particular view not needing a giant crew anymore. I think it's going to be like, you have the tools, you have the vision, stop selling out and watering down what you want to say. Just go say it, I don't know.
Right. And you had mentioned growing up in a family that emphasized personal sovereignty, but in kind of a forceful way. Like, this is how it is, and this is who we are as individuals, rather than giving like proper space for the individual to explore who they are. And we see a version of this, for example, on college campuses. And I know that you have an experience to share from your time at Ball State University of actually being sort of an enforcer or a snitch.
Oh.
What was that like? And like, how did your approach evolve or change or maybe devolve? I don't know in what direction you went at the time.
Yeah, it's not a period of time I particularly am proud of. I was from Louisville, and I didn't, I had Keys money to go in state, but I wanted to go to a film school, and Ball State wasn't a film school, but it had a lot of clout as a David Letterman communications program and such. And so I thought, okay, the only way I can afford this is if I get a really high paying job on campus. And I was like, well, you got to be a resident advisor. It's very well known that if you want to offset your tuition, you become an RA. And so I had asked around as soon as I got to campus, because I knew I wouldn't be able to stay there if I didn't get this job. And so it was out of a source of kind of desperation that I was like, sign me up. Like I'm ready to take on this responsibility. I take anything I do very seriously. Like, let's see how this goes. What do you need me to do? And what was fascinating about that whole experience is that, and again, this is 2010, 11, 12, that area. So this was right when Occupy Wall Street was about to happen. The social issues were there, but it wasn't anything like what it is right now. And so what I found interesting was, they sort of baby step you into this process of like, hey, you're going to learn how to host programs on your floor for all of your different residents. And so when I went into this, I thought, how hard could it be? Like you are res life, as we call it back then. In my naive way of thinking was, we're providing a place for these people to live. That's all. We're just providing a dormitory, and we just need to make sure it's safe from physical harm, and make sure that they can study in an environment that is conducive to learning. That's what I thought res life was. I thought you paid all this money to get into a dorm. But what I learned was, and again, it's been some time, but it's interesting that I've heard all these stories since then. What I've learned is that res life is far more than just a place to stay and getting a key to a door that you go in and out of between your studies. Res life is, no, you need to be conditioned to understand how to live among people that think differently than you. So yes, your academic formation is important, but while you live in this dorm, you're going to learn how to live with other people, and we're going to teach you how to do it. And that was pretty new to me. And I was like, okay, well, how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to have these programs on your floor X number of times, and we're going to approve what the programs are. Here are what the themes need to be in the programs. And even saying that word, I'm like, programs? I'm going to program 60 guys on this floor? Like, this is weird. But that was kind of the thought, was you were monitoring the halls to make sure that people were, not getting into any trouble, and the list of activities they could do or couldn't do seemed to always grow. And ultimately, what also seemed to happen was res life was getting a lot of, I don't know if it was pressure or certainly was influence from guest speakers from what would become the DEI offices. So the diversity industrial complex, even back in 2012, was so obvious, but we didn't know what to call it. We didn't know what was happening. We were just like, I remember my first shock to the system, this good old Christian boy, like going to this meeting. I'm sitting down and, it's like, okay, everybody, here's the feeling stick. I want you to express all of the different type of relationships out there. And suddenly my mind just gets opened, because I'm like, okay, like there's heterosexual relationships, there's homosexual relationships. I know about those, but no, there's 15 other types of relationships, and you need to learn how to accommodate all of them. And I was like, what are we doing here? Like,
this was like in 2012.
This was in 2012.
Oh.
I had no idea what to do. And all I knew was I can't lose this tuition money. Like, I don't want to go back and look like a dummy for having gone out from home and crossed the threshold and then failed. So, I did conform for a while, and I regret it immensely. And, it was a year and a half or so before I said, you know what, I'm not going to play by the rules anymore. And so I did. Basically, I had this relationship with the guys where it was like, hey, make sure you don't get anyone hurt, and make sure, make sure you're studying and doing what you need to do, but like, just be cool. Just live and let live. And earned a lot of respect for it, and certainly didn't break any rules necessarily that were required of the job until actually, and this is what's kind of funny, it was like the last day of the semester, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna have some beers. So I had some beers in the dorm, and like literally got caught by Res Life, and was like, okay, thank you so much, because this is the exit I need to go and be who I'm supposed to be. So I took the fall, and I don't mind saying it now because everyone's since graduated. It doesn't matter anymore. There were a couple other RAs that were in there, and I said, nope, it was all me. Let them stay. They can keep doing whatever they want to do. It was all me. So I took all of it and then said, you know what? I'm going to use this opportunity to rent a house with some guys that have similar thoughts as an artist. A couple of them were musicians, had the best remaining time of my life as a college student. Like, and it was all centered around making films. I made a club, ended up making that feature film, Cheery Point, sold my plasma to afford groceries doing it. Like, I felt more alive than I ever was. And that reaction, that film, it is all as a reaction against what I experienced in the dorms. And that really set me off on a course of saying, I don't want to make people afraid anymore. I don't want to scare people anymore. I want people to be excited and joyful, and learning should be fun. It shouldn't be scary. It shouldn't be frightening to explore and be curious and do all these things. And I think it all has to do with the conditions you set. So we made a club. I think at its height, it had about 60 to 70 people. And then I learned so many other things that, if you care to, at some point we can talk about, but that experience at the university really set me up to kind of go 180. And I never was like, as a kid, I was always like, it's like, yeah, I'm the altar boy, but I'm also listening to Blink-182 music. I like the punk rock, vibe. So I think that's always been the contention within me is I like the tradition. I understand the importance of the transcendent, but I also understand you got to lighten up, folks. This is getting crazy. Like, so anyway, sorry, that was a long story, but that's what happened.
Yeah, it was a rather early experience of you freeing yourself from the collective and the force, and going off more or less on your own or with like-minded individuals, and just creating art as a response to your experience, which is often how the creative process goes, right? And just fast forward a bit to your experiences with the BLM movement, initially being infatuated by it. Why do you think you were infatuated by it? Like, and what was your experience like? What was the timeline? Because BLM didn't start in 2020; it re-erupted. So, were you exposed to the BLM movement shortly after college?
It was long after college. What happened was there was an individual that had started to do some screenwriting for our company that happened to be a person of color. And I befriended him. And one day, his father had passed away. And I dropped everything I was doing at my desk and said, it just feels like I want to be there for him. So I went to the funeral home and prayed with his family and some of the people there. Had no idea who his family was. It just felt like the right thing to do. And from that point forward, I had this spiritual connection with a like-minded writer that enjoyed exploring sociopolitical concepts. I had no idea he was a Marxist. I had no idea he was, very, very motivated towards, it wasn't shortly thereafter that he starts sending me YouTube video. He's like, hey, I really think that you should check out this Antifa thing. Like, I think it resonates with your anti-government vibes. He knew how I felt about the state. He knew how I felt about the current nature of everything. And so I never really fell for that. I was like, I don't think those are the good guys.
There's something about like their aesthetic, the black masks.
But so anyway, fast forward a little bit. I just want to set the scene. Like, I had the spiritual connection with this individual. And so the George Floyd riots start. And I noticed my friends starting getting very active, very involved. And I'm like thinking to myself, okay, I don't know everything. I don't understand everything. I'm willing to admit that look, I fell for authoritarianism before as an RA. Maybe I get this wrong. Like, maybe I need to kind of humble myself and start listening, right? And I love people. I don't want people to hurt. So if I see people in the community that, especially my friend, that seems like there's something bigger going on, I want to listen. So what started this whole thing was I said, listen, we don't have a lot of money to throw around, but if I can, I got to do it separate from the company. But if I can executive produce a documentary, at any point, like, you seem like someone with a kindred spirit that might be able to tell the story in a way that both I understand, and other people that at this time, he was openly saying he believed in the DSA stuff, the Democratic Socialists of America, that sort of thing. And so I didn't really think it would actually apparate, but I was like, yeah, listen, like, if I can help, I will help. And sure enough, all of these cities start coming up with government funding for art projects to sort of assuage the sentiment that's out there. It almost felt like, hey, this is such a tragic thing that we need to distract everybody, like breads and circuses or something. That's what it felt like. So this town in Elgin, Illinois, has a museum, a historical society, and they put up a grant that said, hey, we're going to hire and make this documentary. We need someone to direct it, and we need a production company to do it. The Elgin Society posts this desire for someone to come and shoot and produce and direct this documentary. And my friend says, hey, here's the opportunity. Let's do this thing. And I said, well, listen, I'm going to be very upfront with you. I'm going to write a value statement on what I'm bringing to bear on this project, because I don't want it to be misconstrued. I am a capitalist, and I very much believe in agape love and in the spirit of Dr. King. Like, I value moving forward and trying to make sure that people aren't hurting and are seen as children of God. Like, I'm viewing this from a Christian mindset. Like, that's how I want to move forward. So I'm going to help you because I see you as a fellow brother in that endeavor, like as a Christian. And I had that experience with him at the funeral home. And so we seem to be of terms. And I said, now listen, as a documentary, especially one that's going to be made for a historical museum, this needs to be objective. Like, it needs to cover all the sides, because this is going to be viewed by generations in the future. Like, they're going to look back on this documentary in this museum, and it's going to be an educational tool. So I just want to be clear, like, if it starts going off in a different direction, I'm going to remove myself from the project. So we were okay. So anyway, fast forward a little bit. This was such an interesting experience because for me, it was at this time where the libertarian movement and the BLM movement seemed to be hand in glove, willing to march together and say, listen, none of us like the militarized police. None of us like these things that are systemically seem rooted against everybody. So one side might not believe in liberation ideology, and one side might be against the liberty movement in the traditional sense. But why don't we put our differences aside and let's put our crosshairs on the state, because they're pissing us off, and we'll have unsettled business with each other after that. But right now, there's a lot of people that are being hurt by these really dumb policies that the government is putting forward that aren't helping anybody. So I think that was the original intent, was one side saw the other side of this thing as anarchy, and one side saw the other side of this thing as, let's get back to a constitutional republic with limited, infringement. And I think in practice, it's a lot harder to pull off than you might initially suspect. I mean, but the process of making the documentary was fascinating, because what it really boiled down to was getting police officers in the room, getting activists in the room, getting business owners in the room, because this whole thing precipitated from people in the community had boarded up their businesses prematurely, and people got their feelings hurt because they said, we haven't even done anything. Like, why are you boarding up your businesses? Do you not trust us? Why do you not trust us? We didn't do anything. And so it was in that spirit, that's where the documentary was made. And so the first question that I asked was, what's in the name? The name of the documentary is called Making Space. I said, okay, what do you think making space means? And there were 3 different answers. One faction said making space is about, okay, let's take a time out, let's get everybody to the table, and let's give room to express all of these things that all these people are feeling. And in the classical liberal sense, let's have a discussion and figure this out. The other faction was, wait a minute, no, we need to make space specifically for anti-Black racism to be discussed. And we need to ensure that we bring in a DEI consultant, and we need to make sure that the space that needs to be made needs to be specifically for one community. And really, we need to point out these systemic errors. And what was so fascinating about this is this wasn't an ideological battle between conservatives and liberals. This was an ideological battle between classic liberals and leftists. And I was in the middle of it as a newly converted libertarian, former neocon, saying, good luck figuring this out. Because from my perspective, you all want different things. The government, the city council, was filled with, I can only imagine, people of different ideological persuasions, but the point of contact was clearly a good-natured liberal. They just wanted to do a lot similar to me, wanted to make sure that community felt heard and all these things, but it became so untenable because the more the activists corralled around it, especially the DSA folks, it was impossible to get the thing made. I mean, the first step I took was calling all the people as the executive producer we wanted to interview and say, would you be willing to film? Would you be willing to film? And I was able to get a fair number of them to show up to the table, but then it became about quotas. Well, did you get too many of these people? Did you get too many of those people? Like, why are you putting so much emphasis on this? Even to the point of like, who are we having produce this? Like the crew, like what are the immutable characteristics of these individuals? And it quickly got to the point where I said, look, we're 2 or 3 revisions in. This upset at the screening the activists so badly that we were trying to give it an objective shake that I said, I'm going to give you the footage and I'm going to step away. And I suppose there's a lot of lessons that I learned from it. But one of the primary ones was there was a natural conflict within me of like, look, as a producer, my job is to make sure that no one infringes on the director's vision. That's my job as a producer. Despite how much I disagree with this director, that's my job. And when a studio or a financier says, yeah, but why don't you alter it just this little way so it becomes more palatable? It was very tempting because it's like, well, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with what you're saying. Like, I don't agree with all of this content that's being said, but ultimately my job in this moment is to make sure the director's vision is served. And it was very, very difficult to do that because, it was a moral conflict. And I know that's a long story, but I guess it just, in conclusion, it is to say that, I think that there is an ongoing struggle that classic liberals, especially those that believe in expansive government, are going to continue to have with leftist ideology. It became so crystal clear to me that these individuals, despite their best intentions, they do not know how to talk to leftists. They don't know how to they don't know how to navigate those situations. They shut down, they get scared, they forfeit, the ability to institute change that their constituents want. So actually nobody gets what they want. So that's what I found most interesting from my experience. Coming in, it was like, oh my gosh, you're never going to be able to get the police to talk with these activists. That wasn't the problem. The problem was how to get the liberals and the leftists to get the thing across the finish line. So, yeah, that's the story of the documentary. And I think I'm curious what your thoughts are on it.
Well, what I was hearing is that the classical liberal side was more principled and objective, and in your role as the producer, you wanted to tell the story fully, and I guess you could say objectively, as much as humanly possible, whereas the more leftist Antifa leaning side wanted to elevate certain stories that they felt were unheard, which I guess you could say is sort of like a more like avant-garde artistic standpoint of like emphasizing certain stories, even though they may or may not be backed with fact. I hate to put it that way. I'm not familiar with these specific stories in the specific film, but that largely comes from like a subjectivity mindset where like everything's a perspective and there's no objective truth, and we all just want to share our feelings. And I value both. I mean, I think art is largely subjective. But when you're creating a film centered on a socio-political issue, on something larger than just one person or even one group of people, with many different stories coming into play, including the stories of some of the cops or some of the bystanders. It's really necessary, I think, to do the topic dignity, to strive for a more objective form of expression. And I find it really frustrating, like whether it's like as an artist or just as a human being trying to navigate the world and relationships, when someone believes that the world is subjective. And at times that can just be from a lack of principle, whether it's a lack of spiritual principles or just, other forms of belief systems that allow the person to say, like, this is what I believe and this is why, and these are the principles I follow, guiding principles. Without that, you're kind of just left with chaos and anarchy, which is what, you said the other side was wanting, is really like, okay,
well, it was so fascinating too. Like, this is one example. Like, when we first sit down to sign the contract, it was very obvious that they wanted the collective to sign the contract. It's like, you can't legally sign a contract as a collective.
What do they sign? The collective and cursive?
Well, and that's the whole thing is like, and the argument I suppose that would be levied is like, well, that's a capitalist construct, and even that is proof in point that you don't have a valued interest in supporting the community. And it's like, folks, I don't have to do this. I'm doing this because I'm not even an Illinoisan. Like I want to help people, and it's coming from agape love, not from a sense of, finger pointing or revenge or whatever else. Like, yes, there's reform that can be made, certainly in some ways, and that can be discussed. But, I think I've just had a deeper realization that, like, for a revolution to be justified, it has to have some sort of spiritually informed vision of what it's going to look like on the other side. And if what you're suggesting on the other side of that is Chaz, anarchy, or even, a communist state, like, I don't have to support your vision. I'm sorry, but I'm not, because we've tried it before and it resulted in the worst atrocities that we could imagine. And like, it's just crazy to me that we want to try some of this again. And
yes, but we can do it differently this time, right? We can get
right.
It right.
And like, that's why, but by the same token, like, I'm quick to the Nietzsche quote of, like, be careful looking into the abyss, you'll become, that sort of thing. That which you are worried about. I've experienced that on the right as well. Like, I have seen that. I've seen anarchy desired by the right as well. In fact, I almost fell prey to it, going to the War on Us conference in Washington, D.C., and meeting all these libertarians. And at some point we can talk about it, but that was, I think my understanding now is, whenever I'm going to stand up and I'm going to vocalize my disdain or support of something, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look to my right and I'm going to look to my left, and I'm going to understand, at least broadly speaking, what those people believe in, because I don't want to be involved in a mindless mob anymore. I don't want to be involved in, the very reason that the religion I adhere to exists is because of a mindless mob that gave in to the demands, that it was wrongfully, it didn't understand. It was the convergence of a stressed out governor, Pontius Pilate, with a mindless mob that said, give us Barabbas. And it's going to happen again and again and again. And I think that's just, maybe that is just human nature, but it's not something, it's just something that we can avoid, in my opinion. I don't know. That's just my feeling.
I think if you believe that humans have a special level of consciousness and intellect that animals do not have, then yes, we can avoid we can avoid the herd mentality, unlike some other animals. Let's just take a few minutes to hear about your experience at the War on Us conference, and then we can take a break and explore some other themes that have been coming up.
Cool. The War on Us was another formative experience that I had in the last few years. I still think about it because it opened up my eyes to, like, a whole other world that I didn't know existed. Again, like I mentioned before, I grew up in a very traditionally conservative household. The war in Afghanistan and Iraq were, no question, that's what we should be doing. America, hoorah, rah. Like, let's do this. Without, and I'm being overly simplistic, but it was just support the troops, support your nation. That's what it is. And it wasn't until I got to DC, how this all started was, I didn't feel like I was doing enough. Like, I felt like, I was like, man, I just did this documentary. It actually did not, it didn't support anything that I actually believed in all that much. And I feel like I need to, I was seeing my kids, as they were going a little bit older, and I was like, I don't feel like I'm doing anything to solve this issue. Like, the pandemic, BLM was kind of, that had happened. The pandemic was the next thing. And I was getting really angry and really anxious. And I felt like I was like, if I'm just going to complain all the time, then I forfeit my ability to really do anything. So let me try and do something. So I apply to this Ron Paul Institute of Peace and Prosperity Scholarship. I give them my film and say, like, I want to come and I want to learn what's going on in DC. Like, I'd like to be a scholar. I was accepted. I'm granted the tuition to attend. I fly out to DC, and I'd been to DC before, but it was more to see monuments. It wasn't to do any sort of thing like this in politics. And I'd always had a tangential interest in politics, but, I didn't want to, it wasn't until recently when I've changed my viewpoint on, you hear that thing where don't talk about politics at the dinner table. Don't talk about this at the dinner table. And it drives me nuts because I think that's one of the reasons we've gotten where we are right now is nobody knows how to talk to each other anymore because we have multiple generations where that sort of nonsense was like encouraged. So I was like, no, I'm going to go and I'm going to figure out what's going on. I just want to see it for myself. So anyway, the way that the conference was set up was, of course, Ron Paul, are you familiar with much of Ron Paul?
Of course.
Okay. Sorry. I didn't know. Ron Paul was very much always adamantly against the war movement that a lot of the neocons was pushing and had a very interesting view on the Fed and financial spending and everything. So that's who I thought I was going to listen to. But what I was introduced to is this broad movement of other factions on the right that believe in materializing liberty in different ways. So, like, as an example, I never knew what a paleo conservative was. I didn't know what those were. And so when I met some of them, I was like, you're the folks that I want to kind of hold at arm's length. Like you want to go back to a conservatism that is not so good. You want to like kind of like people aren't necessarily as included. It definitely feels like it's not like white nationalist, but it's like, it's very like, it doesn't feel as inclusive. I'm trying to give you an example of someone you might like. Who was it that just spoke with Vivek Ramaswamy recently?
Was it Russell Brand?
No, it was, she has an ongoing conversation with Bill Maher, who actually talks to her for some reason. I can't remember. It'll come to me. Ann Coulter.
Oh.
Okay. So Ann Coulter would be a paleo conservative. On the surface, you talk to her and it sounds like a lot of conservative talking points, but the more you talk to her, you're like, oh, wow, you don't want immigrants to run the government at all. Like, that's strange. Why don't you kind of chill out a little bit? So there weren't a ton of those people, but I learned of what that was. Then I met libertarians and figured out that libertarians they have so many different flavors of libertarianism. There's the Mises Caucus. There's, have you heard of the Mises Caucus?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there's Mises Caucus. Then there's people that resonate more with the left-leaning culture war issues. There's, and so all of a sudden I'm like, okay, here's what I'm not. I don't believe in endless wars and regime change. And I think that 30 some odd $1 trillion in debt is not sustainable. I think this whole thing's about to fall apart. Who are you guys?
Well, those are some hot takes.
Would you not agree in some way? Or are you saying those are just too controversial?
I'm saying they're just so controversial these days, but I would like to think a normal person from 2018 would agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the War on Us conference was all shrouded in the pandemic. It was RFK Jr. shows up and everybody goes quiet because we're like, what is this Democrat doing here? Like, I mean, this was before he had even announced his candidacy. So we were like, wow, this guy's got stones. I mean, he's a Kennedy and he's walking up to this podium and he's talking in front of all of these people that on any other issue probably disagree with him however much percentage of the time. But I started talking with him. I started talking with, obviously Ron Paul, talked with Congressman Thomas Massey. And so I starting to understand, okay, these are disaffected liberal folks that just want to control the spending and have the government leave them alone. And they don't believe in regime change wars, and the vaccines are an infringement on our autonomy. And it was just all the things that I needed to hear at the time. And I really enjoyed my experience there. I mean, as with any liberty loving crowd, you're going to have some kooks, and it's fun. Like you realize, like, it's a big tent. You got a lot of people with a lot of different thoughts, but I enjoyed it. I thought, okay, this is a party that can laugh at its kooks. Like, fine, they can laugh it off. That's fine. But it was super fascinating. Just you got to remember, at that time, the rest of DC is shut down. There's still a barricade around the Capitol. Like, a lot of it is still, there's hushed tones as we're coming in off the bus from the airport of like, who are these people? Like, why are you guys not wearing masks? Like, and it almost felt like we were like this little ragtag group of folks that that were recognizing an issue, and at least we're coming from all these different communities across the states. So anyway, the experience at the War on Us conference really opened my eyes to seeing a lot of folks, vets a lot of the time, from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, that had been terribly injured, or who had thought back on their experience in the war and thought, why did I do this? Why did I go and do all these things? I think I was misled by my government. So that was an interesting experience.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I imagine that quite a few of our audience members maybe have attended similar events or are following them from a distance. And with your perspective as an artist too, I think you have some really unique takes on the world and how you're bringing certain topics to light.
So, and one of the most profound experiences I think I had at the conference was Jacob Hornberger, who was a previous candidate for the Libertarian presidency. He came in and spoke with us, and up until that point, I had never heard someone articulate such an enthralling tale of how American history had evolved through the lens of interventionist policies that the government had forced down on people. And it really changed how right now I'm viewing, for example, so much of what we were taking for granted as fact since World War II. Like, I'm really starting to look at and say, okay, for example, the post-World War II order of, a lot of these truths, basically a lot of the conservative principles of like a Nikki Haley or a neocon, I feel like stem from that period. And that's not necessarily stemming from 1776, like a Vivek Ramaswamy would. And for me, hearing that tale of Waco, of Ruby Ridge, of the Tuskegee experiments, of all of these Operation Paperclip and Northwoods, and these are real things that the government has done. And it's kind of laying out for me this idea that maybe we don't need to go back to all of these things our grandparents have been saying made great America great, but we actually need to go a little bit further back and keep a lot of the social advancements we've made to make it more equal for the people around us. But this idea of actual freedom being the spirit of 1776.